So we've been thinking about wisdom for the last few weeks, and we've thought about the wisdom of the ancient Near East. Thank you so much. We've thought about the wisdom, thank you, of the Old Testament and the wisdom that we find there for daily living. Excuse me, this is going to sound weird on. Too bad. Right. The wisdom of Jesus. We've thought about Jesus as wisdom teacher, haven't we? And about his invitation to non-dual thinking, to the single eye, seeing clearly. But what about today? How do we see clearly? If Jesus was a wisdom teacher, was he just a wisdom teacher for that time? Do you guys want to go out? Do you guys want to come out? You all right there? Don't get too bored. Wisdom teacher for this day or just for his time? And how do we understand our meeting and our response to Jesus' invitation, come and see, which is the way he answered people who said, well, who are you? What are you teaching? He said, come and see. How do we do that today? For some people, there is a real sense that they have already seen. And sometimes there is a moment of recognition. Sometimes there's a moment of recognition that what you thought you saw is not what is. We talk about the epiphany of seeing God. I think there's also a moment, I don't know if you can have such a word as disepiphany, but that moment when actually you realise that God isn't quite what you thought God was. I remember some years ago, somebody I knew well, another Christian minister, coming to me as a counsellor and saying, in great distress, I've lost my assurance of salvation. And I felt like saying, well, welcome to the rest of us. That's how we live. But this was hugely distressing to him because he'd always, from childhood, had this sense that he was special, he was saved. And then suddenly, one morning, he'd woken up in the realisation that this was an illusion. Where do you go from there? And after much talking, we ended up talking about choice. About the fact that you actually have to choose life. It isn't just handed to you. In the same way you have to choose God. God doesn't happen to us as if from some, outside agency, not beamed down by an alien. God is a God we have to choose. The divine experience is the moment of recognition that we have to have. The epiphany is ours today, if you want to use theological words. We find it in so many ways. And how do we do that? In this sense now that the God we thought we knew is no longer the God we can speak of. God after the death of God. God is no longer this sovereign, omnipresent, omnipotent being who somehow tinkers with our world in response to our prayers. If only we get the prayers right, if only we say the right things, do the right rituals. God is not a magic God. How do we relate to that God? How do we return once we have spotted the illusion? How do we return to a sense that actually there is a reality to God, but it's not the reality we thought it was? And the word that's often used, particularly by my favourite writer of the moment, Cynthia Bourgeault, is it's a wager. We take the risk. We make that acceptance of the wager of saying yes to God, despite our doubts. And that's what our readings were about, really. The Lord, in some way we don't know, comes in the guise of strangers to Abraham and is given hospitality, as is usual for that culture, and it's given more than just a little bit of bread and some water to wash your feet. You know, kill the choice calf and give them a feast. And they bless the family, they bless Sarah with this promise of a son. And what's Sarah's response? Doubt, denial, laughter, mockery. And yet, in the end, she still bears Isaac. She is still the mother of nations. That's how she's identified in the Jewish religion. And the same with Mary. Mary is the dutiful daughter, but as we had in our reading, she hears Gabriel's announcement, "Greetings, favoured one, the Lord is with you." And she's much perplexed. Well, you would be, wouldn't you? She's troubled, in other translations. She's troubled, and she ponders this in her mind. She's turning it over. You can almost hear the little voices in her head saying, yes, go with it, this is God. And others saying, be sensible, this is going to cause huge problems. But in the end, she has a yes for God. Despite the doubts, in the midst of the doubts and the ponderings, her yes is said to this God that she suddenly realised acts far more strangely than she ever thought. And it troubles her. So in the midst of doubts, in the midst of troubling thoughts, that moment of recognition is there for Sarah and Abraham and for Mary. How does she know that, and how does she respond? What is it that enables her to say yes? What is it that actually happens? And I think there is this moment of recognition. Despite the troubling thoughts, despite the laughter and the doubt, there is something that answers. There's a yearning in Mary and in Sarah to say, yes, this is possible for me. And they answer with their bodies. Quite literally, in the case of Sarah and Mary, they have a child. You can't get much more bodily than that. But Mary's response to Gabriel particularly is one of this inner knowing. It's not one of head knowledge, it's one of the bodies responding to an invitation of God, an invitation to experience God in a way that they hadn't before. The sacred is something that surprises. It's a felt knowledge, not a head knowledge. It's a thing given, not made. It's not something that we can construct in advance or think out. It's the wager of faith. It's the risk-taking. It's the making a choice to say yes. Cynthia Bourgeot identifies various practices, what she calls wisdom practices, as ways in which we can enable ourselves to experience this other knowing. This knowing which is not head knowing, but which is heart knowing. She calls it tuning into the heart frequency that Jesus is broadcasting on, to use the old radio analogy. I'm not sure it works these days. Who listens to the radio apart from me? But it is going back to that heart knowledge and bypassing the head knowledge. It is about seeing in a different way. It's about having the single eye and saying, actually, I am going to allow this, I don't know quite what it is, to recognise me as I recognise him or it or her or some pronoun we don't actually have. Cynthia Bourgeot talks about wisdom practices like centering prayer or meditation, like chanting, like saying the Psalms, like Lectio Divina. Some of us have practiced that, this idea of this very slow reading of Scripture, allowing it to sink in. Talks about the Eucharist, being from a Catholic background. I would want to put in there things like meditation, things like mindful practices, things like engaging with creation. Places and ways in which we can have that moment of recognition, once all the illusion has been stripped away, that God is not this magician who will come in and tinker with everything. How do we encounter that God? How do you encounter that God? So I want to ask you to get into little groups and actually to consider that question. You'll find the questions actually on your notice sheet. Jesus invited people to come and see, but we're accustomed to thinking things through. That's the way it's always worked for us in the past. We worry about a problem and, we'll find a solution. But this is not that kind of knowing. How do we, in these days, come and see? When we're not trying to encounter Christ in Scripture or our faith tradition, there's nothing wrong with that. This is just a different kind. What methods might we use to discover our embodied sense of the divine? That moment of recognition, of knowing someone, something radically other, greater than ourselves. What practices so far have led you to that moment of recognition? Have you had that moment? In what ways? Where did it come? And how might you in the future choose to do that? In small groups. Talk to your neighbours. Discover what that experience has been for them, for each other, and then we'll share together.